This is Duke University.
I'll try to be obedient to time, but just please signal me because you can go slower. One of the advantages of talking on slides is you can go slower or faster depending if needed. I am also going to do my best to be a relatively obedient participant in this conference in that I'm going to speak directly to the theme, literally in a simple-minded way, and raise questions that are quite literal questions about what it means to move and to exchange in an unequal world, and to try and think about that problem in action, in practice. And I'm doing this through an example of the global and an organization which specifically and directly has global ambitions. Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And the way I thought I would start with this is, of course, all of you know that the term global has disseminated widely through many different reaches, including an area which has emerged called global health as opposed to international health. And although MSF, that's Doctors Without Borders, did not start necessarily to be global health, there's a sense in which they were global health before there was global health. It's where the phrase without borders, which has become a catchword of globalization, later was picked up by business and a whole set of other organizations, where it first was popularized. And so I want to ask quite seriously, literally, what is the global and global health? Not simply to dismiss it, because it does contain particular ambitions, especially about mobility, which is what I want to focus on today. And I want to ask two very simple questions, which are, I'm posing them as very abstract questions, but they're not abstract questions when they're put into practice by an organization like MSF. How much is life worth? What should it be worth is implied in the question. Of course, this is a literal question, it's potentially an economic question, but it's also a moral question, this phrasing. And how much should people be paid? Quite literally. It's a question that concerns many, many people on this planet, obviously. And we want to think about these two simple questions in practice and see what happens to them. So this is what I'll be trying to do in my 15 allotted minutes. That's using MSF as a case example is to try and think about politics in a non-governmental form, the NGO form. And MSF is expressly defining itself around ethics, but of course it has politics and it has economics as it moves through the world. To recognize them as a true NGO, because they are, as much as when we talk about an NGO form, they live up to it, they are non-governmental, they are largely privately funded as opposed to depending on government funds, which many NGOs do. And they also, rather neatly for purposes of this conference, they're about 40 years old, the same as this program. So there's a certain kind of parallelism. And there's a parallelism and a lot of concern about movements, exchanges, connections, comparative work that would move beyond and through nation states and the nation state framework of what the international meant in the 1960s. And MSF, importantly, was founded to be an alternative, initially a French alternative to the Red Cross. It later became transnational. It's no longer French. And I'm going to speaking about it as if it were one thing, but it's not. It's a federation and a complicated organization at an organizational level. It's also quite established at this point. It's a big, rich international NGO as far as NGOs go. I'll get to it in a moment. Initially, its orientation was very much focused around emergency, responding to emergencies, which is partly the rationale for its mobility. It's to respond to exceptional states, not to things which are endemic or ongoing. And even while it does a whole range of projects which are non-emergency projects, indeed that's the minority of the projects now, its basic ethos is defined around emergency, the emergency sense of crisis. It also has a beautifully simple moral focus, saving lives. So this is where my first question is coming from. Also, what is life worth? And MSF's answer is, lives are priceless. Lives are beyond the market. They should be beyond the market. Of course, they're not beyond the market, but they should be beyond the market. And they should be equal. Every life on the planet should be equal. This is sort of the basic moral position. It's beautiful, it's simple. As an abstract question, once you put it into practice, it's quite complicated. Of course, saving lives has a history. There's a set of different kinds of projects to save lives. Historically, the different NGOs which became famous in the humanitarian end of the aid world, like Save the Children after the First World War, or Oxfam during the Second World War, they emerged with a certain sense of saving lives. There's also, going back to 1909, I think, the missionary version of saving lives. So just to note very quickly, this has a history, but also this has particularity in the present in the form of MSF. This is a secular version of saving lives. There's no immortal soul. There is no certainty of rebirth or some other rationale for something extended beyond this body in this moment. And it's also the body as it's understood biomedically. So that's the thing which is actionable. That's the thing which you can try and work on and you can try and treat. And you can see this rather neatly in the shift of the symbol that MSF used, that they shifted from, once they were sued by the Red Cross and they had to drop the cross, they shifted in the middle 1990s to this human form. So in a way it nicely represents the secular understanding of the human, which is at stake. So what I want to explore is how they try to pursue equality in a world that is deeply unequal, because they have this moral focus of saving lives. It's supposed to be an operation that is driven by ethics rather than politics or economics, but of course, again, it has a political and economic aspect to it. Forgetting a point with movement. And what I really want to look at specifically is how borders are crossed. If you're going to be sans frontière and you're going to move across borders, what does that mean in practice? And of course, some people cross borders more easily than other people. We all know that. This is one of the functions of citizenship. Even if one is past the nation state in one sense, the nation state matters tremendously once it's reduced down to this little card that you carry that identifies you and gives you great access. So just looking very quickly, what I'll be trying to do is mundane questions of people, money, and borders, who can move and at what cost, especially if we're trying to practice something, some kind of engagement that is global, some kind of engagement that is border crossing. And so looking at the micropolitics of global connection, what happens at the very individual specific level, and 3 sketches, which I will probably only give you really the first one today, but I'm happy to explain more. I'll just reference the others, and I'm happy to explain more about the other pieces of this, that there are different people moving through this structure of MSF, of Doctors Without Borders. You have expatriated staff, that's people who are crossing borders. You have national staff, that's people who have not crossed a border. And then there is an effort, recently by MSF, to decolonize. This is their term, their anxiety term of recognizing there's inequality and wanting to do something about it. And so this is looking at what citizenship means in motion and what differential status, political and economic status means in motion. Once you have mobility in an unequal world, I suggest that one reaches a place where there are many double binds, there are aporia, there are some things which is very difficult to come up with a simple and neat and clear solution to this problem of inequality once you're engaging it at the level of practice. And so the ethic of equality encounters the reality of inequality. So what is the globe in terms of actual practice for MSF? What is sans frontière? Well, this is a map. It shifts a little bit every year by year, where they have project countries, and you can look at any NGO and find the space of aid, the global space of aid for different groups. The red bits will move in one direction or another, but there are also patterns to it. And if you look at this over time, year after year, you will see quite a few patterns. The center of the world for the aid world, and certainly for global health, is Africa. And if I had a better imaging program to have more time, and I spend a lot of effort, I would give you a 3D map. But I will just instead give you a pie chart, which is very simple to produce, to show you, again, it's slightly different, 1 year off in budget, but this varies a little bit, whether it's 3/4, but it's between 50-something% and 3/4. Most of the money that MSF has is expended in Africa. So Africa would be the peak, would be the height, it would be the biggest chunk of the world. And that's true generally speaking in terms of MSF's budget. One thing to note is that it's on the rise, and the budgets of many humanitarian entities have been on the rise through time, especially over the last decade. And then secondly, what I referenced is that this being a true NGO, most of the money that MSF is raising is not coming from institutional donors, it's coming from fundraising. It's getting regular people to donate, and they're very, very good at that because saving lives is an appeal, especially saving lives in emergency is an appeal that's easy to fundraise for. Some problems are easy to fundraise for, other problems are harder to fundraise for. Actually, go back 1 second, that little bump there is the South Asian tsunami. That's a moment of fundraising that you can see. And then, just to put this in context, I'll very quickly show you. I'm just setting a red thing here to have a sense of size, because often when people are talking about international organizations, they never mention difference of size and scale and so on. And some are bigger and some are smaller. So just to give you an example, Partners in Health, which is very popular in lots of talking about this in anthropology, is very, very small in financial terms compared to something like, sorry, I don't have the American Red Cross on here, but which is huge. Also, certainly something like bilateral humanitarian aid or World Vision, which is a Christian NGO, is much, much bigger in financial terms. And then if we're going to compare scale, quickly, just for political reasons, I want to add in two other things to recognize. One, that all private fundraising is minuscule compared to state allocations. These are the two great moments of bake sales and efforts to get people to donate money in the United States. This is for the tsunami, this is in the US, and this is for Katrina. And it's a few $1 billion. And this is the initial federal allocation for Katrina, and then this was the estimate that somebody just made up of $200 billion of what it would take. Just to have a sense of what is the difference between state money and what is the difference in private fundraising. And then also, when talking about humanitarianism, I feel it's always important to mention other things that are going on, because often people get really wrapped up in critiques of humanitarianism and so on and so forth. And if there are forces of life and forces of death in the world, it's very clear that death is winning. The score is very much on their side. Now, what I want to note for today, the thing which I'm very briefly trying to signal and talk about, is movement. And this is looking through time, and if you went back further, if this were extended way back to 1971, you would see there would be no red lines. As part of the story of MSF is they are shifting their projects, they're growing, they're getting larger, and to do that, they increasingly need support labor in country. And so there's this category which is growing in their projects of national staff. And the people who are symbolically at the core of what Doctors Without Borders when it started the work to be were this blue line, this blue column here, expats, people who are moving across borders. And if you see the number of departures more than the number of people, that tells you that there are multiple leavings during 1 year, during each year. So it's telling you something about the timing of rotation. So a couple of things to note. This is part of the legacy. MSF is a voluntary association. Again, it's a true NGO. It does not have standing legally in the way that something like the Red Cross does. It also intentionally has a relatively modest pay scale. This is an ethical principle. You should not have too great a division, and you should not be paying too much. You should not be getting too much money to do this work. This is ethical work. It should not be business as usual. You should not get rich doing it. And they have an anti-bureaucratic ethos. It started in 1971. It's people who do not like bureaucracy, even if it is now a billion-dollar organization. Over time, also when they started out, they weren't thinking about any of these things. They were not thinking about gender, they were not thinking about age, they weren't thinking about retirement, about having children, they weren't thinking about a life course. This was, going out there into the world and doing something, which is a lot of activism. It's all imagines a mobile person who's free of all obligations and can simply act, which of course sociologically is rare. So this is just to give you a sense of, in practice, what this means. There are many actors in Doctors Without Borders beyond doctors. And those who are as expats in the field, as of the end of the 1970s, they started to receive a stipend, which for the purpose of this, there's some footnotes here, but it will average out at about $1,000 a month, something which would It's like being a graduate student. It's not, you're not going to get rich doing it, but you should be able to live. That's the idea. Of course, it all depends where you're coming from and how you're living. So if you're coming from Belgium or Japan or the United States, and especially if you're a doctor in the United States, $1,000 a month is not a lot of money. If you have medical school debts, it's actually hardship for you. But if you're coming from other parts of the world, if you're coming from Croatia or say Cameroon, to give two examples, and you are a doctor, $1,000 a month would be quite reasonable. And indeed, in the context of the case of the Cameroonian doctor, you could be supporting the whole family on $1,000 a month. So it can be a job for you. So there's a sense in which how much are you paid becomes a very complicated problem when you're trying to think about it in both economic and political terms, but also in ethical terms. Do you have the right spirit? Why are you doing this? Is it just a business? And so all of this is in contrast to being local, and I'll just mention and say more about later if you like, that being local in MSF's world can be complicated, that you have attachments, and it can be complicated to do things if you have attachments and demands on you. And there's kinship, there's language. It's not just a question of money. There are a whole host of ways in which you can be implicated. And at times, not knowing can mean that you can move more freely. If you know, it can be difficult to move. Also, I can note again, MSF is an oppositional ethos. If you have an oppositional ethos, can you turn that into a career? And I'm just going to show you very quickly a few cartoons that come from internal publications of MSF. They're expressing anxieties. Can you, and this is a play on the smoking patch, can you get out? And once you're in this, are you going to spend your whole life here? Are you going to be 65 and you're still trying to be in the field? What would that mean? Can you retire? If you're coming from a place like Belgium, are you going to end up on the streets? Also, there are many things beyond your control if you're living in this world, even if you're raising money privately, as MSF is doing, and you have some independence. They chose that route in order to have greater independence over their finances. If you're doing it through public fundraising appeals, media plays an important role, and the media follows crises. And once a crisis has fallen out of the media, it's much harder to fundraise for it than even though the crisis may not have left. Also, when you're moving around the world, there are a number of contradictions that you find yourself in, that even the material objects you're bringing with you can represent inequality. This is what I'm wearing today is not very expensive, obviously, but it's clean and it doesn't have holes in it, and it's an example. And even dressing informally in certain contexts, like Uganda, where I was doing a lot of research for this, the people who dress informally are the expats. The national staff dress formally because they have to demarcate themselves from those who are non-professionals in the setting, whereas you can be marked already by being simply appearing casually as an expat. Even, no matter where, if you're coming from Japan, even if you're coming from say, South Asia, if you're in Uganda, you can be marked as being different, as being outside. Also, there's a problem of security, which increasingly has become a focus in the aid world, and reveals quite directly and painfully that lives are not equal. And indeed, there are things like kidnapping. It's very clear that there are different prices for different lives. And so all of this results in other anxieties of a shadow of colonialism. How does inequality express itself when you have mobility and it's passing through parts of the world which have a history of colonialism? Well, is this simply the replication of empire? And it's not simply external critiques by academics or the services, but also internal organizations. And so MSF worked very hard, and in 2005, one of the things they were discussing and debating was how to decolonize, how to improve the lot of national staff. And yet, there are certain things they cannot overcome because national staff, by definition, are in country. They have not left. And so they are not a part of the local movement. And MSF, as long as it's a mobile organization, is leaving. And as long as you are leaving, you do not have a permanent relationship. And if you do not have a permanent relationship, it's very difficult to achieve a relationship of equality in a system of mobility. And so, this is where I'll just be ending, and suggest that there are fundamentally, in a world of inequality, when you have movements and exchanges, you will rapidly run into a set of double binds. You will expose certain contradictions. And the SEP may be simultaneously trying to convince a government of something and denouncing a government representative And this is, their world is full of this experience of contradictions. And so this is my suggestion, which I'll explain more if you like later, but I'm running out of time, so I will not go into it in any detail. But there are a set of different kinds of demands, which are by their very nature moving you in different directions, and you're placed in a position where you cannot answer them both satisfactorily. Economic justice versus moral motivation, professionalism, common humanity. Citizenship has very weight, so do lives once they are moved, no longer in relation to local attachment. And so even very mundane questions like how much to pay someone do not have a simple answer. So this is my moral. And then for you, it's the realist sort of vision of MSF, and this is where I will stop. But, to realize there aren't simple answers, but that doesn't mean you should cease